Welcome to the Beltway Broadcast, the premier podcast for the workplace learning and talent development professionals of the Association for Talent Development's Metro DC chapter. We've got some great resources in store for you today.
Hello, fellow ATDers. I'm Christina Eanes, owner of Eanes Training, as well as a chapter, past president, and a member of the Pod Squad here at the Metro DC chapter of ATD. Now, missing from today's episode is my co-host, Stephanie Hubka, who is also a chapter past president and fellow member of the Pod Squad here for the past 3 years, and our producer, Helena Hodges. Now, for today's episode, we are interviewing Michael Watkins. Welcome, Michael.
Delighted to be with you.
Well, before we jump into the topic of the 6 disciplines of strategic thinking, can you share a little bit about your background with our audience?
Sure. So I have 2 lives. Basically, I'm a professor of leadership and organizational change at the IMD Business School in Lausanne, Switzerland, where I teach senior executive programs. And I'm also the co-founder of a executive coaching firm based in the U.S. called Genesis Advisors. I've written extensively about transitions in leadership for, I guess, about 25 years at this point. I tell people I was in my late teens when I started doing this work, Christina, but that's really not true. Educated originally at Harvard Business School and taught at Harvard for about 13 years at the School of Government and the Harvard Business School.
Nice. Well, and so your first book was the first 90 days. So what led you to create this book, this work, 6 disciplines?
Yeah, so in my personal practice, I mostly coach, senior executives taking challenging new roles. Mm-hmm. And that gives me a kind of unique vantage point to some degree of, about what's going on out in the business environment. And something I was noticing was that there just was more and more turbulence that these leaders were having to deal with, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think that comes as any surprise to anybody, right? If you look at what's going on with climate, if you're looking at what's going on with technology and AI, if you're looking at what's going on politically and socially, I sometimes think that we've never, certainly in my lifetime, faced, the sorts of magnitudes of change and potential disruption that we're seeing right now. And so that then led automatically to kind of some thinking about, well, what is it that lets these leaders deal with that, right? Like, how is it that and especially how are some of them seemingly much better able to deal with it than others? And there's lots that's built into that, Christina, right? I mean, their resilience as leaders is important. The adaptability of their organizations is important. But this ability to engage in strategic thinking kind of popped out for me as a real differentiator. And it seemed pretty clear that some of them were like amazing strategic thinkers and some were, good strategic thinkers. And I love problems like that, right? Where you kind of dig in and you're asking yourself, well, what really makes the difference? And I also love to work on things that kind of are evergreen, that have always been with us, probably always will be with us, right? I started out my career studying negotiation, right? Well, people have always negotiated.
Yep.
And then I got into leadership transitions. And of course, that's been around as long as there's been people. And I think the ability to think strategically is kind of in that same, has those same qualities to it. It's something that I think is most likely always been important. And I suspect, unless AI replaces us all, will continue to be important.
Yeah. Well, I almost think that will be even more important because we'll need to provide that human component, right, with AI. And it's I like that we're talking about strategic thinking today because I've noticed in my work with leaders over time, right, you first get promoted, we're deep into those technical skills. Micromanaging is a big issue for first-time managers, right? And then as you move up, strategic thinking, I mean, it's important for any role, really, right? But as you move up, it becomes even more and more important for your role to be able to be successful. Now, I know you've dived down into 6 different areas. Can you share those, and then we can go really wherever you want with those?
Sure. So but I want to just sort of amplify what you just said, right?
Sure.
Because I think it's super important, and I think you obviously know what it takes to be successful changes as you move between levels, right? I mean, you gave a great example of, first-time manager and that tendency to continue to want to do the work, right?
Yes.
And moving from being player to being coach, right, is
Mm-hmm.
super hard the first time you do that.
Absolutely.
As you get up to, leadership team kinds of levels, the shift from being a tactician to a strategist becomes, super important, right? You're expected more and more to engage in strategic thinking on behalf of your own part of the organization, maybe as, part of the leadership team for the organization as a whole. And that's a big shift, right? And as we know, Marshall Goldsmith's famous, what got you here won't get you there, right?
Yep.
So thinking about what's going to get you there if you're going to senior levels, and strategic thinking being a core element of that. And then, the 6 disciplines. So maybe just ratchet back a little bit.
Yeah.
The way I do research on things is to go in and do a whole lot of interviews and kind of immerse myself in a domain.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, frameworks emerge for me often. I'd love to tell you it's like a hugely rigorous, massive database kind of exercise, but that would be completely untrue. It's a much more qualitative exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And the starting point for me was just, what is strategic thinking anyhow,
Yeah.
and trying to get my arms around, the bigger picture of what that is. And, I think one early observation was, there's a lot out there about strategy,
Mm-hmm.
but not that much or much less about the thinking part,
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a gap in my view there, right? And often when you pick up stuff, as I picked up a lot of, that's the other thing I do, obviously, is read a lot about what's already been written about the domain. It almost always was really about strategy. When they were talking about strategic thinking, they were really talking about strategic planning or strategic analysis.
Yeah.
They didn't get deeply into the thinking part of what it is about our mental machinery that does that. And then, that also got me into things like, Kahneman's work on thinking fast and slow and the way the brain works, right, to a degree, because clearly that's where the thinking happens, right? So we need to understand something about that. So I was kind of the background, Christina, for this. And then a number of years ago, I did some work with a cognitive psychologist at Harvard, Max Bazerman, about what we call predictable surprises.
Mm-hmm.
And we wrote a book called Predictable Surprises, the Disasters You Should Have Seen Coming and How to Avoid Them. And one of the models we built up in that original work was this idea of recognizing, prioritizing, mobilizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
In order to sort of see these things coming. And so I sort of reached back into that work a little bit. And sort of came up with my definition of what strategic thinking is, which I'll give you in a minute. I guess before I do that, though, why is it important to have a definition? Because if we don't know what it is, we can't develop it in people, we can't assess it in people. And I was having this experience doing these interviews, and I'd ask somebody, what is strategic thinking? And there'd be this pause, thoughtful look.
Uh-huh.
And then often, it was, I know it when I see it. Right?
Yep.
And that's not very satisfying, right?
Mm-mm.
And I think also, I'm sure you, like many people in their careers at some point, are told, you need to work on your strategic thinking, right? And that's code for what exactly, right? And also, how do you do it if you're not in a job that requires strategic thinking, right? How do you demonstrate strategic thinking skill in the absence of a role that requires it, right? There's kind of a chicken and egg thing that's built in. A colleague at IMD and I actually wrote an article about how to communicate like you're a strategic thinker.
Mm-hmm.
It's not in the book, but a lot of it's just about how do you project in conversation, in meetings with with people at higher levels that you are a strategic thinker, because just the communication part, I think, is super important.
No,
So anyway, the net of all that was a definition of strategic thinking that said, look, it's the mental disciplines that let us, recognize emerging challenges and opportunities, and the opportunities are as important as the challenges, establish the right priorities. So prioritization was key to this.
Yeah.
And then mobilize your organization to respond, right? So that recognize, prioritize, mobilize. Not an accident that the initials are RPM, right? Not an accident that we want you to go around those cycles quickly, right? So that's just the starting point. And then the 6 disciplines are what lets you do that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the first 3 are really more about the recognizing and prioritizing. So pattern recognition, right? How do we recognize what's important in often very noisy environments, right?
Yeah.
You know, as a business leader, you're looking out of the world, and you need to be able to identify what's consequential and what's just noise. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was originally trained as an electrical engineer many moons ago, and you know, this whole idea of signal to noise ratio was something that was important, right? And as the world gets noisier, the value of being able to see what's truly important, only rises. So that was one. Systems analysis, like looking at the world through the lens of systems. The world is complicated, very complicated. We need ways to simplify it down and identify what's essential. And so that, leaders develop mental models of how markets work, of how organizations work, right? They know that if we do this over here, then we're going to have that impact over there, and it's going to create a feedback loop over here. So how do you start to build up those powerful simplifications of reality was kind of the second key piece. And then the third key piece is what I call mental agility. And I actually I mashed a couple of things together when I did that chapter. I'd originally thought I was going to have 7 disciplines, right? Because 7's the magic number, right, for things. And so, but I ended up putting 2 things together. And the first of those 2 is really your ability to move between levels of analysis, right? I have a CEO I work with who describes it as cloud to ground thinking, right? And the ability to sort of see things from the high level, but also get into the detail when you need to. But probably most important, be intentional about where you are flying, right? What altitude you're flying at. And the other dimension of mental agility is just the chess master, look forward a couple of moves, think about what we need to do now. And that, relates also to pattern recognition, obviously, but also to systems analysis. We know that chess masters look at a chessboard and they don't see what we see, right? We see a bunch of pieces on a board. They see patterns. They see possibilities, right? And so there's that linkage, I think, between those things. But at a minimum, you have to be thinking about, if we do X, what happens? And there was, I think it was back during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think that's right. There was a U.S. general who was famous for basically asking the same question over and over again, which is, and then what? Right? So that discipline of beginning to think ahead, look ahead, work backwards from there into what we're going to do. So those 3 disciplines, the pattern recognition, the systems analysis, the mental agility, I think of as what it takes to be good at those recognizing and prioritizing pieces. And then there's mobilization. But maybe I'll just pause at this point to see. I can happily go on. But
oh no, please continue. This is fascinating. I love it.
Okay. Yeah. So I made a decision early on that I wasn't going to stop with recognition and prioritization, right? Which is where people usually stop when they talk about strategic thinking. Because all of a sudden you're into execution kind of, and you're out of strategy. And so there was kind of this borderline that was there. And I just didn't accept that really made sense, right? Because I think there's dimensions of strategic thinking that are very much about how you mobilize your organization to do things, right?
Yeah.
And so I came up with 3 additional disciplines that I think are about that mobilization piece. The first is about how do you mobilize your team and key stakeholders to take on an emerging challenge or opportunity, right? This is the realm of structured problem solving. It's how you take a team and other key stakeholders through a disciplined process of framing and solving problems, right? So at the end, everyone's fully aligned, fully committed. you've done a rigorous job of looking at the world, and you've got commitment to drive forward with execution. There's again been a fair amount written on structured problem solving, but not much that started with enlist the stakeholders and define the process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in the end, what you're trying to do is move people's minds together, right, in a certain direction. And so that's where I sort of took that work. And actually, a colleague, Julia Binder at IMD, and I actually had an article in the January-February issue of Harvard Business Review about framing and reframing problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how are you sure you're solving the right problem? So that's kind of a side piece. Visioning, right?
Mm-hmm.
But visioning, again, when you read stuff about visioning, it's often about creative imagining of the future. That's important, but it's not all that's important with visioning, because the mobilizing part of it is how do you create a shared vision, and how do you enlist people in a shared vision, and how do you communicate powerfully to your organization what the vision is so people get excited. So that, I certainly, in that chapter talk some about the creative visualization part of visioning. But I think the more important contribution is how do you, Christina, take your vision of where you think this organization should go and translate it into a shared vision that your team stands behind and is excited about, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't do that, when things don't quite work out the way, your vision said, people are looking at you saying, Christina, crappy vision, Christina, and as they back away slowly from you, right? So there's that piece. And then finally, and I think the chapter that probably surprised people the most about the book was the one on political savvy, right? Mm-hmm. Because when you think about political savvy, usually it's emotional intelligence, it's persuasion, maybe it's a little on the side of manipulation, but there's so much strategy that goes into navigating the politics of organizations.
Oh, yeah.
And so there I sort of drew on a lot of the early work I did on complex negotiations, and I did lots of studies of major international negotiations, worked with diplomats, and just something as simple as what order do you talk to people in, right? Mm-hmm. Or when do you talk to people one-on-one, and when do you bring them together, right? Mm-hmm. In diplomatic speak, that's shuttle diplomacy and summit diplomacy, right? But the reality is we people in organizations do that all the time, right? When I teach this stuff, I always ask people, I say, so how many of you have been in a meeting and realized that the real meeting has already happened?
Yeah.
And everyone goes, like hands up.
Yep.
Right? Yep. Been there. So that's the framework, right? Those 6 mm-hmm. disciplines, I think it's reasonably complete around, and I think it's reasonably well organized around that recognize, prioritize, mobilize kind of structure.
Yeah.
And then, of course, but again, I'll pause at this point. There's also obviously stuff about, how do I develop that?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, first, I just want to, this is amazing. I like the whole focus, because usually when I see stuff on strategic thinking or anything related to it, it's a very rational, step by step, this is what you need to do. What's really missing a lot, like similar to what you were saying, is the human element. You can create the best plan in the world, but unless you can get people rallied around it and figure out how to implement it in such a way that it'll be successful. Huge. Yeah.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
So I think, there are related domains that are important, right? Mm-hmm. What I think you're pointing to in part is critical thinking ability, right? So the ability to think rationally, think through data. There's a piece that's about creativity and creative thinking. Mm-hmm. There's a piece that's about design thinking, about how you kind of, enlist people to do things.
Yeah.
So it's, but it's much more than just critical thinking. Right?
Absolutely.
Which is typically what you see when you find strategic thinking.
Yeah. So this gives you the whole package. So then what is maybe the first step in developing this, other than reading the book, obviously?
Yeah, no, that's the absolutely essential first step, yes. Christina, obviously, right? Click the link now. I'm kidding. So I think a few things that are important. by disaggregating it into those disciplines, you can begin to focus in on each one and how you develop the ability to do that. So that's one virtue of kind of breaking things down into pieces like that. But even before you get there, there's this question of, are great strategic thinkers born or are they made?
Or both.
And the answer is yes. I liken it to being a world-class marathon runner, right? You're not going to be a world-class marathon runner if you aren't born with the right lungs and the right muscle tissue and the right frame, body weight to strength ratio, right? No matter, even in my absolute peak of, physical perfection, there was absolutely no chance I would ever be a good runner, right? And I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
It's not a big deal, right? But even if you're born with the endowment, you still need to train super hard to get good at it, right? And then I think disaggregating how much is nature and how much is nurture, I think it's better to sort of say, look, regardless of what my endowment is, how do I get better at it? Because there's nothing you can do about the endowment, right? That's a given. I used to say the same thing, by the way, Christina, when I was teaching negotiation, right? I always used to tell my negotiation classes, I can make you 20% better as a negotiator. And I want a percentage of the proceeds, right?
20%? No kidding.
No one ever sent me checks, sadly, but that's life, right? And I think it's kind of similar with strategic thinking, right? If we can get you 15, 20% better than you are today over all the thinking you need to do in a career, that's worth something. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's just background. And then I think there's a piece about it that is unavoidable, which is getting deeply immersed in a business or a domain, right? So that you learn enough and see enough to begin to build a sense of the patterns that are emerging. I don't think you can be a general purpose strategic thinker and just, kind of be parachuted into any given domain and, give wonderful strategic insights, because you need the depth. I think there's a piece that's about apprenticeship, right? Working with people who are great strategic thinkers. I think there's a piece that's about training. I'm a big advocate, and there's, I think, pretty good research for it, that brain training games are quite good at getting better. And I play
escape
a few every
rooms.
day. Escape rooms, yeah, but I'm thinking also things you just do on a daily basis, right? So my kids, and I play Wordle every day.
Oh yeah.
Right, and we compete. My kids and I play Connections, which is another New York Times game, if you're familiar with it. I'm not a great chess player, but I do the daily chess puzzle, right? And 1 in 5 times I get it right, but I learn something each time. So there's a piece of it that's really about how do you exercise your brain in a way that helps you connect the dots, which is another key part of strategic thinking. Have that facility of thinking ahead. I think there's pieces you can do. And then, of course, there's the whole piece about how do you begin to build strategic thinking capability into your team, too, because you don't want to be the sole strategic thinker in your organization, right? So there's a whole piece that's about that.
Yeah.
And I've written a few articles related to those pieces, right? About, here's a 30-minute daily strategic thinking mental workout, right?
Ooh.
Yeah. Something along those lines. And I can give references to that, folks who are interested.
Excellent.
Or how do you begin to create the context within your leadership team for having strategic discussions, right? Because too often, you're going through going through the agenda, sharing updates, and there isn't really the space to do that. And so, and how are you encouraging your team? Sorry, again, to really engage in strategic dialogue. And I do think there's places for strategic thinking workshops. Scenario planning is a big part of it, right? So how do you get into scenario thinking as a team? I think is super valuable. So it's stuff like that.
Yeah. Nice. Well, before we get to those rapid fire questions at the end of every episode, can you share maybe, well, first of all, how people can find out more about you, your
Sure.
book, and those resources that you mentioned?
Sure. So the easiest way to find me is through LinkedIn,
Mhm.
and I manage my own LinkedIn profile. So if you just look up Michael Watkins, you'll get me, and feel free to send a message, or generally connect. The linkages, maybe I'll provide a few linkages to you, Christine. I don't know if you're able to share those or not.
Sure. We'll
but
put them in the episode description.
there we go. That's probably the simplest way. Yeah. So that's it.
Excellent. Well, yeah, we'll make sure all those links get into the episode description.
Super.
Okay. We're at that point. At the end of every episode, we like to ask each guest 3 rapid fire questions, as you well know from being a previous guest. So, well, it'd be interesting to see what your answers are this time. If they're the same, if they're different.
I hope you're not expecting consistency.
Nope, not at all.
Sorely disappointed.
Because, the Michael today is a different Michael from then, and same with all of us, right? So,
Exactly.
All right. So, what is one book, obviously yours, but another one, everyone must read, and why?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And the answer I came up with, which may be different than the answer from last time, is Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Mm-hmm. And the reason I thought of it, because I was thinking back to obviously influence and political savvy. Mm-hmm. And sort of when I first read that book, which I think was probably back in my 20s, when I was doing a course on strategic thinking, because I was a super nervous speaker, right? Mm-hmm. Today I speak obviously a lot, but there was a point at which I was a super nervous, public speaker, right? And so I took a Toastmasters course, and one thing they had us read was Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? And it was just so far ahead of its time, right? It's about communication. It's about relationships. It's about empathy and active listening. There's little snippets you remember, like you can always find something to like about anybody, right? Just building those connections to people, I think long before, people were talking about growth mindset, he was very much advocating personal developments, resilience, improving your skills and abilities, putting yourself on that curve of continuous improvement, I think was in his book. But just the core stuff about communication, right? About people, about egos, about identity. It's just super, super valuable. And I think has been probably rehashed and rehashed many, many times since. But that to me is the source, right?
Yeah.
And we're talking 1936, Christian, which is when it was published. Yeah.
People are people, though, right? Like you said when we started out, some things are evergreen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Nice. Okay, so what is one tool you can't live without, and you can identify or determine what tool is however you want?
So I think if you're not using one of the AI systems today, you are in deep trouble. I use 3 today, foundation models for different things. I use OpenAI's ChatGPT, which has just been upgraded. I use Google's Gemini Advanced less, but occasionally, and I'm very high these days on Anthropic's Claude 3 Opus tool. And it's just as a kind of almost conversation partner, or just to tell me about this kind of stuff. It's really increased my productivity dramatically, but also you look at the technology and it's just going to change everything, right? So if you're not conversant with the technology, I think you're it's risky, right? I tell everyone I talk with, get out in front of this, right? Learn these tools, learn how to create value with them. Don't, because there's a tidal wave coming, and we got to be ready for it.
Oh yeah. Things are changing rapidly. It's important we stay on top of it. Yeah. Nice. 100%. Okay. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
So this is an interesting one. And as short of a time ago as a few months, I would have answered it differently than I'm going to answer it now. But in the last 4 months, I've been doing a meditation teacher training program. And I was a refugee from meditation, Christina. I'll admit that. I advocated it in my programs. I brought people in to do it in my programs. I watched with interest as they did it.
Yeah.
But I never really did it, right? And then my wife and I, my wife's a serious meditator and coach, and she was going to take this program and kind of convince me to come along. And it's been one of the greatest things I've ever done. And not just because of the practice of meditation, which has its sound bases in neurology, and I've certainly felt the difference in the months I've been doing it. Yeah. But also some of the teaching is just so wise, And you don't need to get into spirituality. You don't need to become a Buddhist to see some of the value in the teaching. And I think the single principle that I learned from this is the principle of beginning again. Right. Of resetting yourself and in the context of meditation, it's your mind will wander, right? Your mind will wander. That's the nature of the mind, right?
Yes.
It's the squirrel,
yes.
kind of stuff, right? And so your mind will wander, right? You don't beat yourself up about that because that's of the nature of the mind. You pull yourself back to your breathing and you begin again, without judgment. And I think that idea has really kind of had a deep resonance for me, beyond the meditation of the ability to simply reset ourselves, right? Yeah. To not get caught up in whatever's got us wound up in knots, not judge ourselves because it's so easy to judge ourselves.
Yeah. Have
some self-compassion, but then begin again.
Yes.
And I've really taken that, I think, deeply to heart.
I love it. Yeah, I myself love it as well. It's like it gives you freedom from going wherever your thoughts take you, which is huge.
Well, we all have a judge inside our heads.
Yes.
Right? And sometimes that judge is pretty brutal.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Just let it go. Yeah. Oh, it has been a pleasure spending time with you today, Michael.
Thank you, Christina. Great to spend time with you too.
And of course, we want to thank our community for listening and or watching. Before you go, we have a message from our producer, Helena Hodges.
Are you interested in partnering with our chapter? For more information, visit dcatd.org/partnerships-sponsorships.
Would you like to be even more involved in our wonderful community? Go to dcatd.org and click on Volunteer to get started.